The wind carried secrets across the Wyoming plains that autumn morning, whispering through the tall grass with a voice that spoke of change. Margaret O'Sullivan stood at her cabin window, her calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The vast expanse of prairie stretched endlessly before her, painted in shades of amber and rust under the October sky. She had no way of knowing that within hours her solitary life would be forever altered by a single act of compassion that would echo through the generations of two very different peoples. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Margaret moved through her daily routines with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to depend entirely upon herself. The small homestead her late husband Thomas had carved from the wilderness 3 years earlier sat like a lone sentinel against the endless Wyoming territory, miles from the nearest neighbor and a full day's ride from the trading post at Bear Creek. She had been hanging wash on the line behind the cabin when the first clouds began to gather on the western horizon. Dark, towering masses that seemed to rise from the earth itself, swallowing the blue sky with alarming speed. The wind shifted, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching rain and something else, tension that made the horses in her small corral stamp nervously and toss their heads. Margaret paused in her work, a damp shirt still clutched in, her hands watching the storm build with the eye of someone who had learned to read the weather's moods. This was no ordinary autumn shower. The clouds moved with a purpose that spoke of violence, of the kind of tempest that could strip bark from trees and turn peaceful streams into raging torrents. She worked quickly to gather the half-dried clothes, her movements urgent but controlled. The wind was picking up now, tugging at her brown hair that had escaped its careful bun, whipping her wool skirt around her ankles. The first drops of rain struck her face like cold bullets, and she knew she had minutes at most before the storm unleashed its full fury. Inside the cabin, Margaret secured the shutters and checked her supplies. Oil for the lamps, kindling for the fire, enough preserved meat and dried beans to last several days if necessary. Thomas had been thorough in teaching her the ways of frontier survival before the fever took him that terrible spring. She had mourned him deeply, but she had survived, finding strength in the routines he had established and the skills he had patiently taught her. The storm struck with the force of a physical blow. Rain hammered against the roof with such intensity that Margaret feared the shingles might not hold. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, seeking entry through every crack and crevice. Lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying displays, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Margaret sat by the fire, trying to concentrate on the sewing in her lap, but her attention kept drifting to the violence outside. She had weathered many storms in this isolated place, but something about this one felt different. There was an energy in the air that made her skin prickle, a sense of impending change that she couldn't shake. It was during a brief lull in the thunder that she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A cry, faint and desperate, carried on the wind. Margaret froze, her needle suspended mid-stitch, straining to hear over the rain. For a moment, there was nothing but the steady drumming on the roof. Then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human. Without hesitation, Margaret set aside her sewing and reached for the heavy wool coat hanging by the door. She pulled it on over her simple brown dress, then took down the oil lantern from its hook. The flame guttered wildly as she adjusted the wick, but it held steady. Opening the door was like facing a wall of water. The rain struck her immediately, soaking through her coat within seconds. The wind tried to tear the lantern from her grasp, but she held it close to her body, shielding the flame with her free hand. Step by careful step, she made her way into the storm. The cry came again, closer now, from somewhere near the small creek that ran behind her property. Margaret followed the sound, her boots slipping in the mud, her lantern casting wild shadows that danced and twisted in the rain. The creek, normally a gentle trickle, had become a rushing torrent that had overflowed its banks and turned the surrounding area into a treacherous marsh. It was there, half submerged in the muddy water near a fallen cottonwood, that she found him. He lay motionless, face down in the shallow water, his long black hair spread like dark silk around his head. Margaret's heart lurched as she realized he might already be too late. She waded into the creek without hesitation, the icy water shocking her system as it rose to her knees. The current was stronger than she had expected, trying to knock her off balance, but she fought against it, driven by a desperation she didn't fully understand. The man was heavier than she had anticipated, but adrenaline gave her strength. She managed to roll him over, and her lantern light revealed a face that was undeniably Native American: high cheekbones, bronze skin, and features that spoke of nobility and strength, even in unconsciousness. Blood matted his hair on one side, and his buckskin clothing was torn and muddy. Margaret didn't pause to consider the implications of what she was doing. In this territory, tensions between settlers and the various tribes ran high, fueled by misunderstanding, broken treaties, and the relentless push of westward expansion. Many of her neighbors would have left him where he lay, or worse. But Margaret O'Sullivan had been raised by parents who believed that suffering recognized no boundaries of race or creed, and that compassion was the highest calling of the human spirit. Somehow she managed to drag him from the water. He was taller than Thomas had been, and powerfully built despite his current helpless state. His buckskin shirt had been decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of skilled hands and cultural pride, though much of it was now stained with mud and blood. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of slipping, sliding, and sheer determination. Margaret had to stop frequently to rest, her arms aching from the effort of supporting his weight. The storm showed no signs of abating, and she knew that exposure would kill them both if she didn't get him inside soon. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she reached her door. Getting him inside required every ounce of strength she possessed, but she managed it, dragging him across the threshold and onto the rough wooden floor near the fireplace. In the warm light of her cabin, Margaret could see the extent of his injuries more clearly. The head wound was serious but not necessarily fatal, a deep gash that had bled profusely, but appeared to have missed anything vital. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and there were numerous cuts and bruises covering his exposed skin, but it was his face that held her attention. Even unconscious and battered, there was something about his features that spoke of intelligence and character. His jaw was strong and well-defined, his nose straight and proud. There were small scars on his hands and arms that suggested a life of action and possibly conflict, but they also spoke of survival and strength. Margaret worked quickly and efficiently, drawing on the medical knowledge Thomas had insisted she learn. She heated water over the fire and gathered her limited supplies: clean cloth for bandages, a precious bottle of whiskey for disinfecting wounds, and needle and thread for stitching. Cleaning the head wound revealed that it was not as bad as it had first appeared. The bleeding had been dramatic but not deep, and once cleaned, it would heal well with proper care. Setting the broken arm was more challenging, but Margaret had helped Thomas tend injured animals often enough to understand the basics. She worked carefully, trying to be as gentle as possible while ensuring the bones were properly aligned. Throughout her ministrations, the man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Margaret found herself studying his face as she worked, noting the character lines around his eyes and the way his hair fell in waves across his forehead. There was something about him that intrigued her, a sense of hidden depths and untold stories. As she bound his arm with strips of cloth torn from one of her own petticoats, Margaret allowed herself to wonder about his story. How had he come to be in the creek during the storm? Was he alone, or were there others searching for him? The questions multiplied in her mind, but she pushed them aside. For now, her only concern was keeping him alive. The storm continued to rage outside as Margaret made her patient as comfortable as possible. She rolled him onto one of her quilts near the fire, covering him with every blanket she could spare. His skin was cold to the touch, but she could feel warmth beginning to return as the fire's heat enveloped him. Sitting back on her heels, Margaret surveyed her work with a critical eye. She had done everything she could with her limited resources. Now it was a matter of waiting and hoping that her efforts would be enough. The man's breathing seemed to be growing stronger, and some color was returning to his bronze skin dot as the night wore on and the storm gradually began to subside. Margaret maintained her vigil beside the unconscious stranger. She found herself drawn to study his features in the flickering firelight, noting details she had missed in her initial examination. His hands, when she lifted them to check his circulation, were those of a skilled craftsman, calloused but sensitive, with long, elegant fingers that spoke of both strength and precision. There was a leather pouch attached to his belt, and Margaret hesitated before examining it. She had no right to invade his privacy, but she hoped it might contain some clue to his identity or condition. Inside, she found several items that intrigued her: a small carved eagle made from what appeared to be elk antler, a few pieces of jerky wrapped in soft leather, and something that made her breath catch, a medallion of some kind, crafted from silver and turquoise with symbols she didn't recognize but that clearly held significant meaning. Margaret carefully replaced the items, but the medallion lingered in her thoughts. It was beautifully made, clearly the work of a master craftsman, and the silver alone suggested that its owner was no ordinary scout or warrior. There was something about the design that spoke of authority, of position within his community. Fire burned low as the hours passed, and Margaret fed it carefully, conserving her wood supply while ensuring that warmth continued to fill the cabin. The stranger's breathing had become deeper and more regular, and she took this as an encouraging sign. Twice during the night, he stirred slightly, murmuring words in a language she didn't understand. But he didn't wake. As dawn approached, the storm finally exhausted itself. The rain diminished to a gentle patter, then stopped altogether. Margaret could hear birds beginning to sing outside, and a pale gray light began to filter through the cracks in her shutters. She had not slept at all, but adrenaline and concern had kept her alert throughout the long night. Looking down at the man she had rescued, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what she had accomplished, certainly she had very likely saved his life, but also apprehension about what would come next. When he awakened, how would he react to finding himself in the home of a white woman? Would he be grateful, suspicious, or hostile? More pressing still was the question of his people. If he had been traveling with others, they would be searching for him. Margaret had no way of knowing whether such a search would bring friends or enemies to her door. The relationship between settlers and the various tribes in this region was complex and often volatile, marked by misunderstandings and mutual suspicion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Somehow she managed to drag him from the water. He was taller than Thomas had been, and powerfully built despite his current helpless state. His buckskin shirt had been decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of skilled hands and cultural pride, though much of it was now stained with mud and blood. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of slipping, sliding, and sheer determination. Margaret had to stop frequently to rest, her arms aching from the effort of supporting his weight. The storm showed no signs of abating, and she knew that exposure would kill them both if she didn't get him inside soon. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she reached her door. Getting him inside required every ounce of strength she possessed, but she managed it. dragging him across the threshold and onto the rough wooden floor near the fireplace. In the warm light of her cabin, Margaret could see the extent of his injuries more clearly. The head wound was serious but not necessarily fatal, a deep gash that had bled profusely but appeared to have missed anything vital. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and there were numerous cuts and bruises covering his exposed skin, but it was his face that held her attention. Even unconscious and battered, there was something about his features that spoke of intelligence and character. His jaw was strong and well-defined, his nose straight and proud. There were small scars on his hands and arms that suggested a life of action and possibly conflict, but they also spoke of survival and strength. Margaret worked quickly and efficiently, drawing on the medical knowledge Thomas had insisted she learn. She heated water over the fire and gathered her limited supplies: clean cloth for bandages, a precious bottle of whiskey for disinfecting wounds, and needle and thread for stitching. Cleaning the head wound revealed that it was not as bad as it had first appeared. The bleeding had been dramatic but not deep, and once cleaned, it would heal well with proper care. Setting the broken arm was more challenging, but Margaret had helped Thomas tend injured animals often enough to understand the basics. She worked carefully, trying to be as gentle as possible while ensuring the bones were properly aligned. Throughout her ministrations, the man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Margaret found herself studying his face as she worked, noting the character lines around his eyes and the way his hair fell in waves across his forehead. There was something about him that intrigued her, a sense of hidden depths and untold stories. As she bound his arm with strips of cloth torn from one of her own petticoats, Margaret allowed herself to wonder about his story. How had he come to be in the creek during the storm? Was he alone, or were there others searching for him? The questions multiplied in her mind, but she pushed them aside. For now, her only concern was keeping him alive. The storm continued to rage outside as Margaret made her patient as comfortable as possible. She rolled him onto one of her quilts near the fire, covering him with every blanket she could spare. His skin was cold to the touch, but she could feel warmth beginning to return as the fire's heat enveloped him. Sitting back on her heels, Margaret surveyed her work with a critical eye. She had done everything she could with her limited resources. Now it was a matter of waiting and hoping that her efforts would be enough. The man's breathing seemed to be growing stronger, and some color was returning to his bronze skin. As the night wore on and the storm gradually began to subside, Margaret maintained her vigil beside the unconscious stranger. She found herself drawn to study his features in the flickering firelight, noting details she had missed in her initial examination. His hands, when she lifted them to check his circulation, were those of a skilled craftsman, calloused but sensitive, with long, elegant fingers that spoke of both strength and precision. There was a leather pouch attached to his belt, and Margaret hesitated before examining it. She had no right to invade his privacy, but she hoped it might contain some clue to his identity or condition. Inside, she found several items that intrigued her: a small carved eagle made from what appeared to be elk antler, a few pieces of jerky wrapped in soft leather, and something that made her breath catch: a medallion of some kind, crafted from silver and turquoise with symbols she didn't recognize but that clearly held significant meaning. Margaret carefully replaced the items, but the medallion lingered in her thoughts. It was beautifully made, clearly the work of a master craftsman, and the silver alone suggested that its owner was no ordinary scout or warrior. There was something about the design that spoke of authority, of position within his community. Fire burned low as the hours passed, and Margaret fed it carefully, conserving her wood supply while ensuring that warmth continued to fill the cabin. The stranger's breathing had become deeper and more regular, and she took this as an encouraging sign. Twice during the night, he stirred slightly, murmuring words in a language she didn't understand. But he didn't wake. As dawn approached, the storm finally exhausted itself. The rain diminished to a gentle patter, then stopped altogether. Margaret could hear birds beginning to sing outside, and a pale gray light began to filter through the cracks in her shutters. She had not slept at all, but adrenaline and concern had kept her alert throughout the long night. Looking down at the man she had rescued, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what she had accomplished, certainly, she had very likely saved his life, but also apprehension about what would come next. When he awakened, how would he react to finding himself in the home of a white woman? Would he be grateful, suspicious, or hostile? More pressing still was the question of his people. If he had been traveling with others, they would be searching for him. Margaret had no way of knowing whether such a search would bring friends or enemies to her door. The relationship between settlers and the various tribes in this region was complex and often volatile, marked by misunderstandings and mutual suspicion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as she looked at the peaceful expression on his sleeping face, Margaret felt her concerns fade. Whatever complications his presence might bring, she had acted according to her conscience and her faith. She had found another human being in desperate need and had responded with compassion. The consequences, whatever they might be, were secondary to that fundamental truth. The stranger slept on as morning fully arrived, and Margaret began to prepare for what she hoped would be his recovery and what she feared might be the most challenging period of her life since Thomas's death. The first light of dawn filtered through the shutters in golden streams, painting shadows across the wooden floor where the stranger lay. Margaret had dozed fitfully in her rocking chair, jerking awake at every small sound, every shift in his breathing. Her neck ached from the awkward position, and her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she remained alert, watching for any sign of consciousness. It came just as the sun crested the eastern hills. A subtle change in his breathing pattern, a slight movement of his fingers against the quilt. Margaret straightened in her chair, leaning forward as his eyelids fluttered. When they finally opened, she found herself looking into the most striking pair of dark brown eyes she had ever seen, deep and intelligent, with flecks of amber that caught the morning light. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Margaret could see the confusion in his gaze as he tried to orient himself, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings of her cabin. His eyes moved from her face to the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn furniture, the shelves lined with mason jars and household items. She watched him catalog each detail with the methodical attention of someone trained to assess situations quickly. When his gaze returned to her, Margaret saw wariness but not fear. He attempted to sit up, then winced sharply as pain shot through his injured arm. The movement brought immediate alertness to his features, and Margaret could see him testing his body's responses, taking inventory of his injuries with practiced efficiency. "Easy," Margaret said softly, rising from her chair. "Your arm is broken. You need to keep still." He watched her approach with careful attention, his uninjured hand moving instinctively toward where his weapons would normally rest. Finding nothing, his eyes sharpened slightly, but he made no aggressive move. Margaret appreciated his restraint, understanding that he was likely fighting every survival instinct to remain calm in this strange situation. She knelt beside him, maintaining what she hoped was a respectful distance. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I found you in the creek during the storm last night. You were badly hurt." The man studied her face as she spoke, and Margaret had the distinct impression that he understood every word, though he remained silent. His eyes were remarkably expressive, conveying intelligence and a depth of character that made her increasingly curious about his story. "Can you understand me?" she asked gently. He nodded slowly, then attempted to speak. His voice, when it came, was hoarse from his ordeal but rich and resonant. "Yes," he said simply, the single word carrying a slight accent that made it sound almost musical. Margaret felt a surge of relief. Communication would make everything easier. How do you feel? Are you in much pain? He considered this for a moment, as if taking a careful internal assessment. Head. Hurts, he said carefully, each word chosen with deliberation. Arm is... He paused, searching for the right term. Broken, Margaret supplied. But cleanly. It should heal well if you don't move it too much. He nodded, then attempted to shift position. Margaret quickly moved to help him, placing additional pillows behind his back so he could sit up more comfortably. As she did, she caught a faint scent that clung to his clothing: wood smoke, sage, and something else she couldn't identify, but that reminded her of wide-open spaces and freedom. "What is your name?" Margaret asked as she settled back. Again, that moment of careful consideration. "I am called Ayana," he said finally, though something in his expression suggested there was more to it than that. "Ayana," Margaret repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. "That's a beautiful name." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It means eternal blossom in my language," he explained, his English becoming more fluid as he continued speaking. "My grandmother chose it when I was born." Margaret found herself smiling in return. "I like that. It's much more meaningful then. Margaret, which just means pearl, and was chosen because my mother happened to like the sound of it." This time, his smile was more pronounced. "Pearls are precious," he observed. "Perhaps your mother saw something in you that you do not yet recognize." The comment caught Margaret off guard with its perceptiveness and gentle wisdom. "You speak English very well," she said, deflecting from the unexpected compliment. "I spent time at the mission school when I was young," Ayana explained. "The priests were determined to teach us their ways." There was something in his tone that suggested this experience had been complex, neither entirely positive nor negative. Margaret nodded, understanding more than he might expect. The relationship between the various missions and the tribal peoples was complicated, often marked by good intentions that didn't account for the value of existing cultures and traditions. "Are you hungry?" she asked, changing the subject to more practical matters. "I have some broth warming, and there's fresh bread from yesterday." Ayana's eyes brightened at the mention of food, and Margaret realized he was probably quite weak from his ordeal. She rose to fetch the meal, ladling steaming chicken broth into a wooden bowl and cutting thick slices from the loaf she had baked before the storm. Feeding himself proved challenging with his broken arm, but Ayana managed with careful, deliberate movements. Margaret watched him eat, noting the way he savored each spoonful as if truly appreciating the nourishment. It occurred to her that he might not have eaten in some time before his accident. "How did you come to be in the creek?" Margaret asked when he had finished most of the broth. Ayana set down the spoon and was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he would answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the memory was painful. "I was returning from a scouting mission," he said slowly. "The storm came faster than expected. My horse spooked at the lightning and threw me. I struck my head on a rock as I fell." He paused, touching the bandage Margaret had applied. "The last thing I remember was the water rising around me." "You're lucky to be alive," Margaret said softly. The creek was running much higher than normal. A few more minutes and... She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood the implication. Ayana nodded gravely. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I am in your debt." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Anyone would have done the same. Ayana's expression grew serious. "No," he said quietly, "not anyone. Not in these times between our peoples." The comment hung in the air between them, acknowledging the reality they both knew but had been avoiding. Margaret was a white settler, alone on her homestead. Ayana was clearly Native American, from one of the tribes that many of her neighbors viewed with suspicion and fear. Under different circumstances, their meeting might have ended very differently. "What tribe are you from?" Margaret asked, her curiosity overcoming any hesitation she might have felt. "Shoshone," Ayana replied, watching her face carefully for any reaction. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. She knew relatively little about the Shoshone people, only that they were considered one of the more peaceful tribes in the region. Thomas had mentioned them occasionally, usually in the context of trading relationships rather than conflicts. "Is your village far from here?" she asked Dot again, that careful pause. "Some distance," he said finally, in a way that told Margaret he was being deliberately vague. She understood his caution. Even though she had helped him, he had no way of knowing her true intentions or what she might do with information about his people's location. Trust, she realized, would take time to build. "Well," Margaret said, standing to clear the empty bowl, "you're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel. It's the least I can do." Ayanna watched her move around the cabin, and Margaret could feel his eyes following her every movement. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it was intense, as if he was studying her with the same careful attention he had given to his surroundings. "You live here alone?" he asked suddenly. Margaret's hand stilled for a moment on the bowl she was washing. "Yes," she said without turning around. "My husband died 2 years ago. I am sorry for your loss." The simple condolence, offered with genuine feeling, touched Margaret more than she expected. "Thank you," she said softly. "It must be difficult," Ayanna continued, "living so far from others." Margaret turned to face him, surprised by his perceptiveness. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I've grown accustomed to solitude. Thomas taught me everything I needed to know about managing the homestead. He must have been a good man." "He was," Margaret agreed, then found herself saying more than she had intended. "He respected the land and the people who were here before us. He always said that there was room for everyone if we just learned to understand each other." Ayanna's expression grew thoughtful. "A wise philosophy. Not all of your people share it." "No," Margaret said sadly, "they don't. Just as I imagine not all of your people trust outsiders." "Trust must be earned," Ayanna said simply, "on both sides." Margaret nodded, understanding that they were discussing more than just general principles. They were negotiating the terms of their own unusual relationship, trying to find common ground despite the vast cultural divide between them. The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside, the distant whinny of a horse. Both Margaret and Ayanna froze, listening intently. Margaret moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. "Do you see anything?" Ayanna asked, his voice tense. "No," Margaret replied. But she remained at the window, watching. "Could it be your horse, the one that threw you?" Ayanna considered this. "Possibly. Stormwalker is well trained. He would return to familiar territory if he could." "Stormwalker?" "My horse," Ayanna explained. "He is special to me. A gift from my father when I completed my first vision quest." Margaret heard something in his voice when he mentioned his father. Respect, certainly, but also something else. Formality, perhaps, or distance. She filed the observation away, another piece of the puzzle that was Ayanna's identity. They listened for several more minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Margaret returned to her seat, though she remained alert for any further disturbances. "Tell me about your vision quest," she said, genuinely curious about this aspect of his culture. Ayanna looked surprised by the question, as if he hadn't expected her to show interest in such things. "It is difficult to explain to someone outside. Our traditions," he said slowly. "I'd like to understand, if you're willing to share." For the first time since awakening, Ayanna smiled broadly, transforming his entire face. Margaret caught her breath at the change. He was devastatingly handsome. When he smiled with a warmth that seemed to light up the entire cabin. "You are not like other white women I have met," he observed. "And how many white women have you met?" Margaret asked, partly teasing but also genuinely curious. "Enough," Ayanna replied with a slight smile. "The wives of traders mostly." "Some." Of the women at the mission, they were different in their interests. Margaret could imagine. Many of the settler women she knew were so focused on recreating the civilization they had left behind that they had little interest in understanding the cultures they encountered in the West. The vision quest, Ayanna continued, is a sacred journey. A young man goes alone into the wilderness, fasting and praying, seeking guidance from the spirits about his path in life. It is how do you say, a passage into manhood. How old were you? 16 summers. I spent 4 days and nights on the sacred mountain, waiting for my vision to come. Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story. And did it come, I mean? Ayanna's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of her cabin. On the third night, as I lay weak from fasting, I dreamed of an eagle soaring high above the valley. But this eagle had been wounded, its wing was broken, and it struggled to stay aloft. I watched it fight against the wind, refusing to give up even as it grew weaker. He paused, his fingers unconsciously moving to touch the leather pouch at his belt. In my dream, I climbed to where the eagle had fallen and cared for its wounds. When it was healed, the eagle spoke to me. It said that my path would serve as a bridge between the earth and sky, between different worlds that needed to understand each other. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine at his words. And the eagle in your pouch, is that connected to the vision? Ayanna looked surprised that she had noticed, then nodded slowly. I carved it myself after the vision, to remind me of my purpose. The medicine man said it was a powerful sign that I was meant to be a peacemaker. Is that why you were scouting for peace? Ayanna's expression grew guarded again. Among other things, he said carefully. Margaret sensed there was much more to his story, but she didn't press. Instead, she found herself thinking about the strange coincidence of his vision and their current situation. Here he was, wounded and in need of care, being tended by someone from the very culture his people often viewed as enemies. If his vision truly spoke of bridging different worlds, perhaps their meeting was more than mere chance. Your people, Margaret said carefully, will they be looking for you? Yes, Ayanna replied without hesitation. But they will not expect to find me here. Will they be upset when they do? Ayanna considered this question seriously. Some will be suspicious. He admitted, my people have learned to be cautious around white settlers. Too many promises have been broken, too many treaties ignored. But you trust me. It wasn't really a question, and Ayanna seemed to recognize that. You could have left me in the creek, he said simply. You chose to save me instead. Actions speak louder than promises. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her choices with such simple appreciation. The sound of horses came again, closer this time and unmistakably. Multiple animals. Both Margaret and Ayanna tensed, listening as the hoofbeats approached the cabin. Margaret moved back to the window, her heart pounding as she tried to see who was coming. 3 riders, she reported quietly. They're still some distance away, but heading directly here. Ayanna struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. Can you see them clearly? What do they look like? Margaret squinted through the crack in the shutter. Native American, she said. 2 men, and it looks like a woman. They're riding slowly, not like they're attacking. My sister, Ayanna said with certainty. And probably my brother and cousin. Nayeli would not rest until she found me. Your sister? Margaret turned from the window, surprised. Nayeli is persistent. She has been tracking me since I was a boy. If anyone could follow my trail after the storm, it would be her. Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that help had come for Ayanna, but also apprehension about how his family would react to finding him in her care. What should I do? She asked. Ayanna met her eyes steadily. Be yourself, he said simply. If they see that you are a good person who helped someone in need, They will honor that. And if they don't, then I will make them understand. There was something in his tone that suggested he had more authority to make such assurances than a simple scout might possess. But Margaret didn't have time to pursue the thought. The riders were almost at her door. Should I let them in? She asked. Yes, Ayanna replied. But Margaret ... He used her name for the first time, and she found she liked the way it sounded in his voice. Thank you for everything. Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion she couldn't name. Then she walked to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it to face whatever consequences her act of compassion might bring. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door latch. Through the wooden barrier, she could hear the soft conversations in a language she didn't understand, the creak of leather saddles, and the gentle snorting of horses being reined in. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the latch and slowly pulled the door open. 3 figures sat mounted before her cabin, their horses arranged in a careful semicircle that spoke of tactical awareness rather than casual arrival. Margaret's breath caught as she took in the sight of them. Each rider carried themselves with a dignity and presence that immediately commanded respect. The woman who sat in the center was perhaps the most striking person Margaret had ever seen. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long glossy black hair that fell in intricate braids, decorated with small silver ornaments that caught the morning light. Her features shared Ayanna's high cheekbones and intelligent eyes, but where his expression tended toward gentleness, hers radiated fierce determination. She wore beautifully crafted buckskin clothing, adorned with elaborate beadwork and patterns of blue, white, and gold that seemed to tell stories Margaret wished she could read. To the woman's right sat a young man who was clearly related to both her and Ayanna. The family resemblance was unmistakable in the line of his jaw and the shape of his eyes. He appeared slightly younger than Ayanna, perhaps in his mid-20s, with broad shoulders and the easy posture of someone completely comfortable on horseback. His clothing was simpler than the woman's, but no less expertly crafted, and Margaret noticed that he carried both a rifle and a traditional bow. The third rider, positioned to the woman's left, was older, perhaps 40, with silver threading through his black hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent his life outdoors. There was something about his bearing that suggested experience and wisdom, and Margaret had the impression that he served as both protector and advisor to the other two. For a long moment, nobody moved. Margaret felt herself being evaluated with the same careful attention Ayanna had shown when he first awakened. She forced herself to stand straight and meet their gazes directly, remembering Ayanna's advice to simply be herself. It was the woman who broke the silence, speaking in rapid musical tones to her companions. Margaret caught the rhythm and cadence of the language but understood nothing of the words. The conversation seemed urgent but not hostile, and she noticed that both men deferred to the woman's apparent leadership. Finally, the woman turned her attention back to Margaret and spoke in clear, accented English. I am Nayeli, daughter of Chief Washakie of the Eastern Shoshone. We searched for my brother, who did not return from his journey. His trail led us here. Margaret felt a shock of recognition at the name Washakie, even though she, isolated as she was, had heard stories of the famous Shoshone chief who had earned respect from both his own people and the white authorities through his diplomacy and wisdom. If this woman was his daughter, then Ayanna was. Your brother is here, Margaret said, finding her voice despite her surprise. He was badly injured in the storm last night. Please, come inside. Nayeli's composed expression cracked slightly, revealing the worry she had been hiding. She dismounted with fluid grace, as did her companions, and Margaret noticed how they automatically positioned themselves to watch all approaches to the cabin, while still focusing their primary attention on her. He is alive? Nayeli asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Yes, and conscious. His arm is broken, and he had a head injury, but he should recover fully with proper care. Relief flooded Nayeli's features, transforming her from a stoic warrior to a concerned sister in an instant. May we see him? Of course. Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. As they passed through the doorway, Margaret caught fragments of their whispered conversation in Shoshone. Even without understanding the words, she could hear the worry, relief, and questions in their tones. She followed them inside, watching as they approached the area where Ayanna lay. Ayanna's face lit up at the sight of his family, and he immediately began speaking in rapid Shoshone. Nayeli dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his injuries as if she wanted to touch him but feared causing pain. The younger man, whom Margaret assumed was the brother Ayanna had mentioned, stood slightly behind her, his relief evident in his relaxed posture. The older man, however, remained alert and watchful, his eyes moving between Ayanna and Margaret, with an expression that was difficult to read. When Ayanna gestured toward Margaret and spoke her name, the man's attention focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. "My brother tells us you saved his life," Nayeli said, rising and turning to face Margaret. "He says you found him in the creek and brought him here, cared for his wounds." "Anyone would have done the same," Margaret replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks under their collective scrutiny. "No," the older man spoke for the first time, his voice deep and measured. "Not anyone. I am Kohana, advisor to Chief Washeki, and uncle to these young ones. What you have done shows great courage and compassion." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness at the formal way he addressed her. "I'm just glad I could help." Nayeli knelt beside Ayanna again, examining Margaret's bandaging work with what appeared to be expert knowledge. "You set his arm well," she observed, "and the head wound is clean. You have skill in healing." "My husband taught me some basic medical care," Margaret explained. "We had to be self-sufficient out here." "Your husband?" the younger man asked, speaking for the first time. His English was less polished than his siblings, but perfectly understandable. "He died 2 years ago," Margaret said simply. "I live here alone now." This information seemed to cause some discussion among the family members. They spoke in quick, quiet Shoshone, while Margaret stood awkwardly nearby, feeling like an intruder in her own home. Finally, Ayanna said something that seemed to settle whatever debate they were having. "My brother says you are a woman of honor." Nayeli translated, though Margaret suspected there had been more to the conversation than that. "He says you asked for nothing in return for your help." "I didn't help him for any reward," Margaret said firmly. "He was hurt and in danger. That was enough." Kohana nodded approvingly at her response. "You speak the truth. We can hear it in your voice." Ayanna struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. He spoke to his family in Shoshone, his tone becoming more formal and authoritative than Margaret had heard before. Whatever he was saying caused Nayeli and the younger man to look surprised, while Kohana nodded thoughtfully. "What is it?" Margaret asked, sensing some shift in the dynamic she didn't understand. Nayeli exchanged glances with her uncle before answering. "My brother has made a formal statement of debt to you. In our culture, when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life. But more than that, they become family." Margaret blinked in surprise. "I don't understand." "It means," Kohana explained carefully, "that you are now under the protection of our clan. Any enemy of yours becomes our enemy. Any friend of yours becomes our friend. It is a sacred bond." "But I didn't. I wasn't expecting." Margaret struggled to find words. "Expectations do not matter," Ayanna said quietly from his position by the fire. "You acted with honor. Honor must be acknowledged." The younger man, who had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, suddenly grinned broadly. "I am Dakota," he said to Margaret, Ayanna's younger brother. "Welcome to our family, sister." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. She had simply done what felt right, and now she found herself somehow inducted into a Shoshone family with connections to one of the most important chiefs in the region. This is all very sudden, she managed to say. Nayel. I smiled for the first time since arriving, and Margaret could see the warmth beneath her fierce exterior. Many of the most important things in life happen suddenly, she observed. The sunrise, the first snow, the moment you meet someone who will change your path forever. But what does it mean, practically speaking? Margaret asked. I mean, I appreciate the honor, but I'm still just a settler woman living alone on a homestead. It means, Kohana said seriously, that you are no longer alone. It means that if you are ever in danger, you have people who will come to your aid. It means that your enemies become our enemies, and your joys become our joys. And it means, Dakota added with another grin, that you now have a very large extended family who will probably visit more often than you might like. Despite her confusion and nervousness, Margaret found herself smiling at his humor. I think I'd like that, she said honestly. It's been quite lonely here since Thomas died. Ayanna watched this exchange with satisfaction, though Margaret noticed that he seemed to be holding something back. There was still something formal in his manner, something that suggested their relationship was more complex than she understood. There is one more thing, Nayeli said, her expression becoming serious again. Our father Chief Washoki will want to meet you. To thank you personally for what you have done. Margaret felt her stomach drop. The chief? But I'm nobody important. Surely that's not necessary. You saved the life of his son, Kohana said simply. To him, that makes you very important indeed. His son? Margaret turned to look at Ayanna with new understanding. You're the chief's son? Ayanna had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I did not lie to you, he said carefully. I am a scout, but yes, I am also the son of Chief Washoki. Margaret sank into her rocking chair, feeling suddenly dizzy. You're a prince, she said faintly. We do not use that word, Nayeli said gently. But yes, Ayanna is our father's eldest son and heir. He will lead our people someday. And you've been sleeping on my floor, eating my broth. Margaret trailed off, realizing how ridiculous her concern sounded. And I have been grateful for every moment of it, Ayanna said firmly. Your kindness was not diminished by your ignorance of my parentage. If anything, it made your actions more pure. Dakota laughed outright at Margaret's expression. Do not look so worried, sister. Ayanna may be important to our people, but he still puts on his moccasins 1 foot at a time, just like the rest of us. Dakota, Nayeli chided, though she was fighting a smile. What? Dakota protested. It is true. And besides, it is good for him to remember that not everyone sees him as the great future chief. Sometimes he takes himself too seriously. I do not take myself too seriously, Ayanna protested, which only made Dakota laugh harder. Margaret found herself relaxing despite the shocking revelations. Whatever titles and responsibilities Ayanna carried, his family clearly saw him as a person first and a leader second. The easy affection between the siblings was obvious, and it made the whole situation feel more manageable somehow. When would the chief want to meet me? Margaret asked, trying to focus on practical concerns. When Ayanna is strong enough to travel, Kohana replied. Our father will not come here. It would be seen as too much of a risk by our warriors. But when his son can ride, we will escort you both to our village. Both of us? Of course, Nayeli said as if it were obvious. Ayanna will need continued care for his injuries, and you are now family. You will stay with us until he is fully healed. Margaret's mind reeled at the implications. But I can't just leave my homestead, my animals, my garden. We will arrange for everything to be cared for, Kohana assured her. Your property will be protected. This I promise you. But why is all this necessary? I helped an injured man, that's all. Nayeli and Kohana exchanged meaningful looks, and Margaret sensed there was something else they weren't telling her. Finally, Nayeli spoke carefully. "Our people have been observing your homestead for some time," she admitted. "There have been reports of white settlers moving through this area with intentions that are not peaceful. Your isolated location makes you vulnerable. What kind of intentions?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Some of your people believe that all land belongs to them by right," Kohana said bluntly. "They do not recognize treaties or boundaries. They take what they want and justify it later." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors of such groups, but they had always seemed like distant threats. "And you think they might come here?" "It is possible," Nayeli said. "Which is another reason why you should come with us, at least until the situation becomes clearer. Or until you are no longer alone here," Dakota added meaningfully, earning sharp looks from both his siblings. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. Ayanna cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Dakota speaks before he thinks." But Margaret had caught the undercurrent in the conversation, the meaningful looks and unspoken implications. Something was happening that involved more than just gratitude for her help, though she couldn't yet understand what it might be. "How long before Ayanna can travel?" she asked, changing the subject. "A few days, perhaps a week," Nayeli assessed, looking at her brother's injuries with a practiced eye. "The arm must be stable before he can ride, and the head injury needs more time to heal." "Then I suppose I have time to think about all of this," Margaret said. "There's nothing to think about," Kohana said firmly. "You have saved the life of our future chief. Our honor demands that we protect you in return. And our hearts." He glanced at Ayanna. "Our hearts tell us that you are meant to be part of our family." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, Nayeli's fierce protectiveness, Dakota's friendly enthusiasm, Kohana's steady wisdom, and Ayanna's quiet intensity. These people had ridden through dangerous territory to find their lost family member, and now they were offering to extend that same loyalty to her. "I'm still not sure I understand everything that's happening," she said honestly. "But I'm grateful for your kindness." "Understanding will come," Nayeli said with a smile. "For now, it is enough that you trust us as we have learned to trust you." As the morning wore on and the initial tension of their meeting faded, Margaret found herself drawn into the warm dynamic of Ayanna's family. They were clearly people of significance and power, but they treated her with genuine affection and respect that had nothing to do with formality or obligation. She was beginning to realize that her simple act of compassion had set in motion events that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But as she watched Ayanna's face light up with laughter at something Dakota said, she found she wasn't afraid of those changes. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret O'Sullivan was no longer alone. The days that followed transformed Margaret's quiet homestead into something she had never experienced, a place filled with laughter, conversation, and the constant presence of people who genuinely cared about each other. Nayeli and Dakota had set up a temporary camp just beyond the cabin, close enough to help but far enough to maintain propriety, while Kohana had taken on the role of perimeter guard, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. Margaret discovered that having Ayanna's family nearby was like being given a window into an entirely different world. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of Dakota practicing with his bow, the rhythmic thunk of arrows hitting their target mixing with Nayeli's voice as she sang traditional songs, while preparing breakfast over their small fire. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, filled with stories Margaret wished she could understand. Ayanna's recovery progressed steadily under the combined care of Margaret's practical medical knowledge and Nayeli's traditional healing methods. Margaret watched with fascination as Nayeli prepared various herbal remedies, grinding roots and leaves with smooth stones while explaining their properties in a mixture of English and Shoshone. This one reduces swelling, Nayeli said, holding up a dried plant Margaret didn't recognize. And this helps bones mend stronger than before. My grandmother taught me these ways when I was young. Your grandmother was a healer? Margaret asked, genuinely interested. All Shoshone women learn healing, Nayeli replied. But grandmother had special gifts. She could see sickness before it showed itself, could feel the spiritual causes behind physical pain. Margaret found herself drawn into long conversations with Nayeli about their different approaches to medicine and healing. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they discovered they shared similar philosophies about treating the whole person rather than just symptoms. White doctors often focus only on what they can see, Nayeli observed one afternoon as they worked together to change Ayana's bandages. They forget that the spirit and body are connected, that healing one requires healing both. My mother used to say something similar, Margaret replied thoughtfully. She believed that worry and sadness could make people sick just as surely as any disease. Ayana, who had been listening to their conversation while pretending to rest, opened his eyes and looked at Margaret with interest. Your mother was wise. What else did she teach you? Margaret felt a familiar pang at the mention of her parents, both long dead from the cholera epidemic that had swept through their Missouri town when she was 18. She taught me that kindness was never wasted, even when it wasn't returned, and that the strongest people were often those who had suffered the most, but chose not to let it make them bitter. She sounds like a woman my grandmother would have. Respected, Nayeli said softly. These intimate conversations, shared while tending to Ayana's injuries, created a bond between the women that surprised Margaret with its depth. She had lived so long in isolation that she had forgotten the comfort of female companionship, the way women could share thoughts and feelings that men often didn't understand. Dakota, meanwhile, had appointed himself as Margaret's teacher in what he called essential frontier skills. Despite his family's obvious concern for propriety, he seemed determined to ensure that Margaret could defend herself if necessary. Your husband taught you to shoot? He asked one morning, examining Thomas's old rifle with professional interest. Some, Margaret replied. Enough to hunt small game and scare off predators, but not enough to fight men with bad intentions, Dakota observed bluntly. This we must fix. And so Margaret found herself receiving instruction in marksmanship from a young Shoshone warrior who treated the deadly serious business of combat with an easy humor that somehow made the lessons less frightening. Breathing is most important, Dakota explained as Margaret aimed at a target he had set up near the corral. Your heart beats fast when danger comes, but you must make your breathing slow and steady, like this ... He demonstrated the technique, his own breathing becoming deep and rhythmic as he took aim with his bow. The arrow flew straight and true, striking the center of the target with a solid thunk. Now you try, he said, stepping back to give Margaret room. Margaret raised the rifle, trying to remember everything Thomas had taught her while incorporating Dakota's new instructions. When she fired, the shot went wide, but not as badly as she had expected. Better, Dakota said approvingly. But you are thinking too much. Trust your instincts. The target is not just a piece of wood. It is a threat to your family. What do you do about threats? Eliminate them, Margaret replied without thinking, then blushed at her own vehemence. Dakota grinned broadly. Exactly, now shoot with that feeling. Her next shot hit much closer to the center, earning enthusiastic praise from Dakota and a nod of approval from Kohana, who had been watching from a distance. But it was her growing relationship with Ayana that occupied most of Margaret's thoughts during those strange, wonderful days. As his strength returned, he began joining in the family conversations more actively, and Margaret discovered that beneath his formal exterior lay a sharp wit and deep thoughtfulness that drew her like a magnet. He would often sit outside the cabin in the late afternoon, watching the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret found herself joining him during these quiet moments, and their conversations ranged from the philosophical to the deeply personal. "Do you ever regret staying here after your husband died?" Ayanna asked one evening as they watched a hawk circle lazily overhead. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There are moments when loneliness feels overwhelming. But this land, it holds Thomas's memory. Leaving would feel like abandoning him." "Memory is not tied to place," Ayanna said gently. "It lives in the heart. You could carry his memory anywhere." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, "but I've built a life here. It may be simple, but it's mine." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "What if someone offered you a different life? One where you were still yourself, but no longer alone?" There was something in his tone that made Margaret's pulse quicken. But before she could respond, Dakota appeared around the corner of the cabin, chattering excitedly about some tracks he had found near the creek. "Bear," he announced. "A big one by the size of the prince. We should be careful when gathering water." The moment between Margaret and Ayanna was broken, but the question lingered in Margaret's mind long after the conversation had moved on to more practical matters. It was on the 4th day of the family's stay that the first real signs of trouble appeared. Kohana had been ranging farther from the cabin each day, scouting for potential threats, and he returned that afternoon with news that made everyone's demeanor turn serious. "Riders," he reported tersely to the group assembled around Margaret's small table. 6 men, maybe 8. Moving this direction, but still a day's ride away. "Our people?" Nayeli asked hopefully. Kohana shook his head grimly. "White men, well armed and moving with purpose. They are not travelers, they are hunting something." "Or someone," Ayanna added quietly, his expression darkening. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Do you think they're looking for me?" "More likely they are looking for easy targets," Kohana replied. "Isolated homesteads, people who cannot defend themselves well." "But you said you've been watching." "My place," Margaret said. "Do you think they know about that?" "It is possible," Nayeli admitted reluctantly. "Some of our scouts may have been observed. If these men know that Shoshone warriors have been in this area, they might assume there are reasons for it." Dakota's hand moved unconsciously to his knife. "What do we do?" "We prepare," Ayanna said firmly, struggling to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "And we consider our options." "Your arm is barely starting to heal," Margaret protested. "You can't possibly fight." "Then we don't fight," Ayanna replied simply. "We leave." "Leave?" Margaret felt her heart sink at the thought of abandoning her home. "It would be temporary," Nayeli assured her quickly, "until the danger passes." "But what if it doesn't pass? What if more men come after these ones?" The family exchanged glances. That told Margaret they had already considered this possibility. "There is another option," Kohana said slowly, as if he were reluctant to voice it. "We could send word to our father. If Chief Washaki were to formally claim this land under treaty protection." "Could he do that?" Margaret asked. "The treaties are complex," Ayanna replied carefully. "But yes, there are provisions that could be invoked. Land granted to treaty allies, protections for those who have shown friendship to our people." "It would mean that your homestead would be under Shoshone protection," Nayeli explained. "No white settlers could claim it or drive you off without violating federal treaties." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the implications. "But why would your father do such a thing for someone he's never met?" "Because you saved his son's life," Dakota said simply. "And because our family has claimed you as one of our own." "There would be expectations," Ayanna said carefully. "Obligations on both sides." Something in his tone made Margaret look at him sharply. "What kind of obligations?" Before Ayanna could answer, Kohana held up his hand for silence. "Someone. Komis," he said quietly. They all froze, listening intently. Margaret could hear it, now the sound of a single horse approaching at a steady pace. Not the thunder of multiple riders that would signal immediate danger, but still cause for caution. Kohana moved smoothly to the window, peering out through a crack in the shutters. "One man," he reported, "old, riding alone. He carries a white cloth." "A flag of truce?" Margaret asked. "Or a trick," Dakota said grimly. But Ayanna was struggling to stand, his face showing recognition. "I know that horse," he said. "It is Blue Elk, one of our elder scouts. He would not come here unless the message was urgent." Nayeli helped her brother to his feet, supporting his weight as he moved slowly toward the door. Margaret followed, her heart pounding with apprehension. The rider was indeed elderly, with long gray hair and a face like weathered leather. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, and his eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the scene before him. When he saw Ayanna in the doorway, obvious relief flooded his features. He began, speaking rapidly in Shoshone, his tone urgent and concerned. Ayanna responded in kind, and Margaret watched the conversation with growing anxiety as she saw expressions of surprise and alarm cross the faces of Ayanna's family. "What is it?" Margaret asked when the rapid exchange finally stopped. Blue Elk looked at her with curious eyes before Ayanna introduced her in English. "This is Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman who saved my life. She is now family." The old scout nodded respectfully to Margaret before turning back to Ayanna and speaking again in Shoshone. "He brings word from our father," Nayeli translated for Margaret's benefit. "A messenger arrived at our village yesterday. The territorial governor has received reports of increased native activity in this region. He is sending soldiers to investigate." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Soldiers?" "A full patrol," Ayanna confirmed grimly. "They will arrive within days. If they find us here... It could be seen as evidence of Shoshone aggression," Kohana finished, "despite the peaceful nature of our presence. So we must leave," Dakota said, "all of us now." "But my home," Margaret protested weakly, "will still be here when this passes," Nayeli said gently. "But if you are seen as collaborating with us by the soldiers, you could be arrested as a spy or traitor." Margaret's mind reeled. In the space of a few minutes, her life had gone from pleasantly complicated to genuinely dangerous. "What are my choices?" "Come with us to our village," Ayanna said simply. "Meet our father. Let him offer you the protection of our people officially. And if I refuse, then we leave you here and pray that the soldiers are reasonable men who will listen to your explanations." Kohana replied bluntly. Margaret looked around at the faces watching her. Nayeli's fierce protectiveness, Dakota's encouraging smile, Kohana's steady wisdom, and Ayanna's intense gaze that seemed to see straight into her soul. These people had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "How long do we have?" she asked. "We should leave within the hour," Blue Elk said in carefully pronounced English. "The army patrol is moving faster than expected." 1 hour to decide whether to abandon everything she had built for the past 3 years and trust her fate to people she had known for less than a week. It should have been an impossible choice, but as Margaret looked at Ayanna, still weak from his injuries but standing protectively near her despite his condition, she realized the choice had already been made. These people had become her family, and the family protected each other. "I'll need to pack some things," she said quietly, "and secure the animals." "We will help," Nayeli said immediately. "Everything will be ready." As the group scattered to prepare for their departure, Ayanna caught Margaret's arm gently. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Once you come to our village, once you meet our father, there will be no returning to your old life." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I think my old life ended the moment I pulled you from that creek," she said. "I'm ready to see what the new one holds." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression at her words. a warmth and intensity that made Margaret's breath catch. But before either of them could say more, Dakota's voice called out urgently, "Riders! On the horizon, we must go now." The time for choices had ended. The time for consequences had begun. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of controlled chaos as the group prepared for immediate departure. Margaret's hands shook as she gathered her most precious possessions, Thomas's wedding ring, her mother's Bible, the few photographs she had of her family back east. Everything else would have to be left behind, trusting fate and the promise that this separation was only temporary. Nayeli moved through the cabin with efficient precision, helping Margaret select only the most essential items. "Bring warm clothes," she advised. "Our mountains are cold, even in autumn. And anything that has special meaning to your heart, we cannot replace memories." Outside, Dakota was securing Margaret's animals with remarkable speed and skill. Her milk cow, Bessie, and the 3 chickens would be released to forage for themselves. A decision that broke Margaret's heart, but was unavoidable. Her 2 horses, however, would come with them, as would her old mule, Jasper, who could carry additional supplies. "The horses are good," Dakota announced with professional approval as he checked their condition. "Strong backs, sure feet. They will serve well on mountain paths." Kohana had taken charge of the overall evacuation strategy, his military experience evident in the way he organized their departure. "We take the old hunting trail west," he explained to the group. "It is longer than the main path but hidden from the valley road. If the soldiers follow the obvious route, they will miss us entirely." Blue Elk, meanwhile, had positioned himself as a lookout on the cabin's roof, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the approaching patrol. "Still time," he called down quietly. "But not much. The dust cloud grows larger." Ayana sat on Margaret's porch, frustration evident in every line of his body as he watched the others work around him. His broken arm made him virtually useless for the physical preparations, and Margaret could see how much it cost his pride to be dependent on others during such a critical moment. "I should be helping," he said when Margaret approached with a bundle of his clothes she had washed and mended during his recovery. "You are helping," Margaret replied firmly. "You're keeping watch while we work. Leadership isn't always about doing the most physical labor." He looked at her with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You understand more about leadership than most people I know." "I learned from watching my husband," Margaret said. "Thomas always said that the best leaders were the ones who knew when to step back and let others use their strengths." "Your husband was wise," Ayana observed. "I regret that I will never have the chance to meet him." Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely, but before she could pursue the thought, Nayeli appeared in the doorway. "Everything is ready," she announced. "Margaret, can you ride in your dress, or do you need different clothes?" Margaret looked down at her long wool skirt and realized the impracticality of trying to make a desperate escape while riding side saddle. "I have some of Thomas's old pants," she said, blushing slightly. "They might work." "Good," Nayeli said approvingly. "Modesty is important, but survival is more important. Our grandmother always said that a dead woman's virtue helps no one." Few minutes later, Margaret emerged from the cabin wearing Thomas's old work pants, belted tightly to accommodate her smaller frame, and one of his heavy wool shirts. She felt strange and slightly scandalous in men's clothing, but undeniably more prepared for whatever lay ahead. Dakota let out a low whistle of approval. "Now you look like someone who can ride with warriors," he said with a grin. "Very practical." "And very improper," Margaret muttered, but she was smiling despite her embarrassment. "Propriety is for peaceful times," Kohana observed. "These are not peaceful times." Blue Elk's voice called urgently from the roof. "They come." "I see the patrol, perhaps 2 miles distant, moving fast along the valley road." "Time to go," Ayana said. Struggling to his feet with Nayeli's help, the group mounted quickly. "Ayana, requiring assistance to get into his saddle with his injured arm. Margaret noticed that despite his obvious pain, he sat his horse with natural grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. Nayeli rode beside him, ready to steady him if needed, while Dakota took point and Kohana brought up the rear. Blue Elk would remain behind briefly to ensure their tracks were properly concealed. As they rode away from the homestead, Margaret turned back for one last look at the life she was leaving behind. The small cabin looked peaceful and inviting in the late afternoon sunlight, with smoke still rising from the chimney and her garden showing the last blooms of autumn flowers. It was hard to believe that, in a few hours, soldiers would be searching through her personal belongings, trying to determine whether she was a threat to territorial security. "It will be here when you return," Ayanna said quietly, having noticed her backward glance. "Will I return?" Margaret asked. Honestly, Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "Much will depend on what my father decides, and what you choose when you understand all of your options." There was something cryptic in his response that made Margaret want to press for more information, but the need for silence as they entered the concealed trail made further conversation impossible. The hunting path Kohana had chosen wound through dense stands of aspen and pine, following natural contours that kept them hidden from anyone traveling the main routes. The trail was narrow and sometimes treacherous, requiring all of Margaret's attention to keep her horse safe on the rocky footing. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Margaret began to appreciate the strategic thinking behind the route selection. From several vantage points, she could see the valley spread out below them, including the distant dust cloud that marked the army patrol's approach to her abandoned homestead. The soldiers would find an empty cabin in cold ashes, with no immediate indication of where the occupants had gone. "How often do you use this trail?" Margaret asked Nayeli during a brief rest stop. "Our hunters have used these paths for generations," Nayeli replied. "Long before white settlers came to this valley, our people knew every rock and stream in these mountains. And now you use them to avoid soldiers who are trying to protect settlers like me," Margaret said with irony. "The situation is complicated," Kohana said diplomatically. "Not all soldiers are enemies, and not all settlers are friends. We have learned to judge each person individually." "What will the soldiers think when they find my cabin empty?" Margaret asked. "They will search for signs of where you went," Blue Elk said, having caught up with the group after completing his concealment work. "But the trail I left will suggest you fled east toward the trading post, not west into our territory." "False trails," Dakota said with obvious admiration. "Blue Elk is a master of misdirection." The old scout shrugged modestly. "When you are outnumbered, deception becomes more valuable than strength." As the afternoon wore on and the trail climbed higher, Margaret began to feel the effects of the altitude and the emotional strain of the day. Her head ached, and she found herself breathing hard even during the easier stretches of the journey. Nayeli, riding beside her, noticed her discomfort. "The thin air takes getting used to," she said sympathetically. "Rest when you need to. We are in no immediate danger now." "How much farther to your village?" Margaret asked. "We will not reach our village tonight," Ayanna replied from ahead of them. "We will camp at the sacred spring, where my ancestors have rested for countless generations. Tomorrow we will continue to our home." "Sacred spring?" Margaret was intrigued despite her fatigue. "A place of power," Nayeli explained, "where the spirits of the mountain speak to those who know how to listen. It will be good for Ayanna's healing." "And for yours as well. I'm not injured," Margaret protested. "All wounds are not of the body," Kohana observed. "You have left behind everything familiar. Your spirit needs time to adjust to this change." Margaret found this perspective both foreign and oddly comforting. The idea that emotional transitions required the same care as physical injuries was something she had never considered, but it made intuitive sense. As evening approached, The trail led them to a natural clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. At the center of the space, a small spring bubbled up from beneath a ring of smooth stones, creating a pool of crystal-clear water that reflected the darkening sky like a mirror. "The sacred spring," Ayanna announced, and Margaret could hear reverence in his voice. The spot was breathtakingly beautiful, with an atmosphere of timeless peace that seemed to settle over the group as soon as they entered the clearing. Margaret dismounted carefully, her legs stiff from the unaccustomed riding, and found herself drawn immediately to the spring itself. The water was so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom, and it emanated a cold that suggested great depth despite its modest surface area. Strange markings were carved into some of the stones that ringed the pool, symbols that looked ancient and mysterious to Margaret's untrained eye. "My people have been coming to this place for more generations than anyone can count," Nayeli said, joining Margaret beside the spring. "Our warriors come here before battle, our women come here before childbirth, our elders come here when they feel death approaching." "What do they seek?" Margaret asked. "Clarity," Ayanna replied simply. "The water shows truth to those who are ready to see it." Margaret looked into the still surface of the pool and saw only her own reflection staring. Back-tired, uncertain, but somehow more alive than she had felt in years. "What kind of truth?" "That depends on what questions you bring with you," Kohana said as he began unpacking supplies for their camp. As the group set up for the night, Margaret noticed that each member of Ayanna's family approached the spring, individually, kneeling beside it for a few moments of what appeared to be prayer or meditation. She felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply personal and sacred. "You may drink from the spring if you wish," Ayanna said, having noticed her hesitation. "The water welcomes all who come with respect and honest intentions." Margaret knelt beside the pool, as she had seen the others do, cupping the cold water in her hands and sipping it slowly. It tasted unlike any water she had ever encountered, pure and somehow alive, with a clarity that seemed to extend beyond the physical sensation of drinking. As she knelt there, the events of the past week seemed to flow through her mind like the water itself. Her quiet, solitary life had been completely upended by a single decision to help a stranger in need. Now she was fleeing through mountain wilderness with people who had become precious to her, in ways she was only beginning to understand. "What am I doing?" she whispered to her reflection in the pool. "Following your heart," Nayeli said softly from behind her. "The spring knows the difference between those who run toward something and those who run away from something. You are not running away." Margaret turned to look at the young woman who had become such an important friend in such a short time. "How can you be so certain?" "Because fear and hope feel different," Nayeli replied. "You carry hope with you, even in your uncertainty." That night, as they sat around a small, carefully concealed fire, Margaret found herself the center of attention as Ayanna's family shared stories of their people's history and traditions. Dakota regaled her with tales of famous hunts and legendary warriors, while Kohana spoke of the complex relationships between the various tribal nations and the challenges of maintaining peace in changing times. "Our father has worked his entire life to find ways for our people to survive in a world that grows smaller every year," Kohana explained. "Some warriors believe the only answer is to fight until death. Others believe we should abandon our ways entirely and try to become like white people. Chief Washaki seeks a middle path." "What kind of middle path?" Margaret asked. "Learning what we can from your culture while preserving what is most important of our own," Ayanna replied. "Making treaties that we can honor and that will be honored in return. Finding ways to share the land rather than fighting over who owns it." "Is that possible?" Margaret asked. "We believe it must be," Nayeli said firmly, "because the alternative is the destruction of everything we hold dear." As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Margaret found herself sharing stories of her childhood, her marriage to Thomas, and her struggles to build a life in the wilderness. In return, she learned about Ayana's education at both the mission school and under traditional Shoshone teachers, Nayeli's role as a healer and diplomat within their community, and Takota's dreams of becoming a great warrior like their father. And what are your dreams, Margaret? Ayana asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the darkness. The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked her about her hopes for the future, rather than just her immediate needs and concerns. I used to dream of having children, she said slowly. Thomas and I hoped for a large family, but... She trailed off, the old pain still sharp after all these years. The dream is not dead, Nayeli said gently. Sometimes dreams must wait for the right time and the right circumstances. I'm 32 years old, Margaret said with a bitter laugh. In most people's minds, that makes me an old woman who has missed her chance. In our culture, Kohana said seriously, a woman's value is not measured only by her ability to bear children. Wisdom, courage, compassion, these things matter more than age. And besides, Takota added with his characteristic grin, 32 is not old. Our grandmother bore her last child at 38 and lived to see his grandchildren. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at their casual acceptance of her worth, beyond traditional expectations. It had been so long since she had felt valued for who she was, rather than what she had failed to achieve. What other dreams do you carry? Ayana pressed gently. Margaret thought carefully before answering. I suppose I dream of belonging somewhere, she said finally. Of being part of something larger than myself. Thomas and I had that for a while, but after he died, I've been so alone. You are not alone now, Nayeli said simply. No, Margaret agreed, looking around at the faces illuminated by the dying firelight. I'm not. As the group prepared for sleep, arranging their bedrolls around the carefully banked fire, Margaret noticed Ayana struggling with his injured arm. The long ride and stress of the day had clearly taken a toll on his healing body. Let me check your bandages, she said quietly, moving to kneel beside his bedroll. As she carefully unwrapped the cloth, Margaret was pleased to see that the bone seemed to be setting properly and there were no signs of infection. But she could see the strain in Ayana's face, and she realized he had been hiding the extent of his discomfort throughout the day. You should have said something, she chided gently as she rewrapped the arm with fresh bandages from her pack. There was nothing that could be done, Ayana replied. Complaining would only have worried my family unnecessarily. Your family isn't fragile, Margaret observed. They can handle knowing when you're in pain. Perhaps, Ayana said. But a leader must be strong for his people. A leader must also be honest with his people, Margaret countered. How can they trust your judgment if you hide important information from them? Ayana looked at her with surprise, as if he had never considered this perspective. You speak very freely to someone you barely know. Do I barely know you? Margaret asked, her hand still gentle on his injured arm. It feels like I've known you much longer than a week. Something shifted in Ayana's expression at her words, a vulnerability that he usually kept carefully hidden. I feel the same, he admitted quietly, as if the spirits brought us together for a purpose greater than either of us understands. Margaret's breath caught at the intensity in his voice. What kind of purpose? Before Ayana could answer, Takota's voice carried across the clearing. Brother, you should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. The moment was broken, but the connection between Margaret and Ayana seemed to strengthen rather than fade. As she settled into her own bedroll, Margaret found herself thinking about purposes and destinies, about the strange turns life could take when you least expected them. Above them, the stars shone with a clarity impossible in the lower elevations. And Margaret fell asleep to the sound of the sacred spring bubbling quietly in the darkness, carrying away her fears and uncertainties like leaves on a stream. Tomorrow she would meet Chief Washeki and learn what role she was truly meant to play in this unfolding story. Tonight, for the first time in years, Margaret O'Sullivan fell asleep, feeling truly safe and completely loved. Margaret woke to the sound of morning birdsong and the gentle murmur of the sacred spring. For a moment, she lay still in her bedroll, watching the early sunlight filter through the pine boughs overhead and create dancing patterns of gold and green. The peace of the place seemed to seep into her bones, filling her with a calm she hadn't felt in years. Around the clearing, Ayana's family was already stirring. Nayeli knelt beside the spring, her hands cupped as she performed what appeared to be morning prayers. Takota was checking the horses, his movements quiet and efficient. Kohana sat cross-legged near the cold ashes of their fire, his eyes closed, in meditation. And Ayana. Margaret turned her head to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good morning," he said softly when he saw she was awake. "Good morning," Margaret replied, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. Her hair had escaped its braid during the night, and she was acutely aware that she was still wearing Thomas's old clothes. "How did you sleep?" Ayana asked, and Margaret noticed that he looked much better than he had the night before. The lines of pain had eased from his face, and there was color in his cheeks again. "Better than I have in a long time," Margaret admitted, sitting up and trying to tame her unruly hair. "There's something about this place ... The spring has healing powers," Ayana said simply. "Not just for the body, but for the spirit as well. My people believe it connects us to the wisdom of our ancestors." Margaret looked toward the crystal-clear pool where Nayeli was still praying. "Your sister seems very devout." "Nayeli has always been close to the spiritual world," Ayana explained. "Our grandmother said she was born with the sight, the ability to see things others cannot." "What kind of things?" Ayana hesitated, as if unsure how much to reveal. "Visions sometimes. Dreams that show possible futures. It is a gift, but also a burden." Before Margaret could ask more questions, Nayeli rose from beside the spring and approached them, her expression serious. "We must leave soon," she said without preamble. "The spirits whisper of changes coming to our village. Father will want to see you before the day grows old." "What kind of changes?" Ayana asked, immediately alert. Nayeli glanced at Margaret, then back to her brother. "It is difficult to explain. I sense anticipation, joy, but also fear, as if something long awaited is finally about to come to pass." Margaret felt a chill despite the warming morning air. "Does it have something to do with me?" "Perhaps," Nayeli said carefully. "Or perhaps with the choices that will soon be offered to you." The cryptic response left Margaret with more questions than answers, but Nayeli had already moved away to help with the morning preparations. Margaret found herself watching the young woman with new curiosity. If Nayeli truly had prophetic abilities, what had she seen about Margaret's future? The second day of travel took them deeper into Shoshone territory than any white person had ventured in decades. The trails became even more challenging, winding through narrow passes and across rushing streams that required careful navigation. Margaret's respect for the skill of her companions grew with each difficult passage they successfully negotiated. As they climbed higher, the landscape around them changed dramatically. The familiar plains and foothills gave way to true mountain wilderness, towering peaks crowned with early snow, vast forests of pine and aspen, and valleys so remote they seemed untouched by time itself. Margaret began to understand why the Shoshone had been able to maintain their independence for so long. This was a country that would be nearly impossible for an army to penetrate, much less conquer. "How far does your father's territory extend?" Margaret asked during a rest stop beside a cascading waterfall. "Territory is not the right word," Kohana replied thoughtfully. "We do not own the land in the way white people understand ownership. We are caretakers, guardians. Our responsibility extends as far as our ability to protect and nurture what the Great Spirit has given us." "But surely there are boundaries," Margaret pressed. places where other tribes' authority begins. There are traditional hunting grounds, sacred sites that belong to specific peoples, Ayanna explained. But the boundaries are fluid, based on relationships and agreements rather than lines drawn on maps. It sounds complicated, Margaret observed. All meaningful relationships are complicated, Nayeli said with a smile. Simple rules work only for simple people living simple lives. As the day progressed, Margaret began to notice subtle changes in her companions' behavior. They sat straighter in their saddles, their conversations became more formal, and there was an air of anticipation that hadn't been present during the first day of travel. Even the horses seemed to sense they were approaching something significant, stepping with higher energy despite the challenging terrain. "Are you nervous about seeing your father?" Margaret asked Ayanna during a quiet moment. "Always," he replied. "Honestly, my father is a formidable man. Wise just, but not easily impressed. He will judge you fairly, but his standards are high. What will he want to know about me?" "Everything," Ayanna said simply. "Your background, your character, your intentions. Most importantly, your heart." "My heart?" "Whether you genuinely care about our people, or whether you are simply looking for protection and advantage." Margaret considered this soberly. "And how will he determine that?" "By watching you," Kohana interjected, having overheard their conversation. "Chief Washakie has an uncanny ability to see past words to the truth beneath. He will know within minutes whether you are sincere." The thought of being evaluated so thoroughly by such an important man made Margaret's stomach twist with anxiety. "What if I fail his test?" "Then you will be escorted safely back to your homestead with an honor guard and our gratitude for helping Ayanna," Nayeli said matter-of-factly. "But you will not be offered the deeper protections our family can provide. And if I pass?" The family members exchanged meaningful glances that told Margaret there was much more to this answer than anyone was willing to reveal yet. "If you pass," Ayanna said carefully, "then many new possibilities will open before you." It was mid-afternoon when they crested a final ridge, and Margaret got her first glimpse of the Shoshone village. The sight took her breath away. The settlement, sprawled across a protected valley, with perhaps 200 tipis arranged in careful patterns that spoke of both practical and spiritual considerations. Smoke rose from countless fires, and Margaret could see people moving about their daily activities, women working with hides and beadwork, children playing elaborate games, men tending to horses in corrals that seemed to contain hundreds of animals. But it was the central area of the village that truly captured Margaret's attention. A massive tipi, easily 3 times the size of any of the others, dominated the heart of the settlement. It was decorated with intricate paintings that even from a distance appeared to tell complex stories, and it flew banners that moved gracefully in the mountain breeze. "Your father's lodge?" Margaret asked. "The council lodge," Ayanna corrected. "Where the important decisions affecting our people are made. Father's personal lodge is smaller, more modest." As their party descended into the valley, Margaret became aware that their arrival had been noticed. People emerged from their tipis to watch the procession, and she could see children running ahead to announce their approach. The attention made her acutely self-conscious about her appearance and her obvious status as an outsider. "They're staring," she murmured to Nayeli. "Of course they are," Nayeli replied with amusement. "When was the last time a white woman entered our village as an honored guest rather than a captive or traitor? You are a curiosity, but also a symbol of hope. Hope for what?" "That understanding between our peoples is possible," Ayanna said quietly. "My father has worked for years to find ways to coexist peacefully with white settlers. Your presence here, the circumstances that brought you, could be seen as a sign that his efforts are blessed by the spirits." The responsibility of representing such symbolic hopes felt overwhelming to Margaret. She had simply helped an injured man. How had that single act of compassion grown into something with such far-reaching implications? Their horses were met by a group of young warriors who took charge of the animals with respectful efficiency. Margaret noticed that each of these men treated Ayana with obvious deference, confirming what she had already begun to suspect about his true importance within the tribe. "The chief waits for you in the council lodge," one of the warriors reported. To Ayana in English, clearly for Margaret's benefit. "All of us?" Ayana asked. "All of you. He wishes to hear the full story from all who witnessed it." As they walked through the village toward the great tipi, Margaret found herself the focus of intense but respectful scrutiny. Women paused in their work to watch her pass. Children peered around their mothers' skirts with wide, curious eyes, and elderly men nodded gravely as if her presence confirmed something they had long expected. "Do they know why I'm here?" Margaret asked quietly. "News travels quickly in small communities," Kohana replied. "By now, everyone knows that you saved Ayana's life and that you have been claimed as family." "Claimed as family?" "A formal designation," Nayeli explained. "It means you are under our protection and entitled to our loyalty. But it also means you have obligations to us in return." Margaret was beginning to realize that every aspect of this situation carried cultural significance. She didn't fully understand. Each step seemed to draw her deeper into commitments and relationships that extended far beyond her original act of helping an injured stranger. The entrance to the council lodge was guarded by two warriors who stepped aside respectfully as Ayana approached. Inside, Margaret found herself in a space that was both magnificent and humbling. The lodge was large enough to hold perhaps 50 people, with elaborately decorated walls that told visual stories of tribal history and mythology. Sweet-smelling smoke rose from a central fire, and the entire space seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. At the far end of the lodge, seated on a raised platform covered with beautiful rugs and furs, was a man who could only be Chief Washeki. Margaret's first impression was of immense dignity and quiet power. The chief appeared to be in his 70s, with silver-streaked hair that fell to his shoulders and a face marked by deep lines that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. He was not a large man physically, but his presence filled the entire space, commanding attention and respect without any apparent effort. He wore traditional clothing that was clearly ceremonial, elaborately beaded and decorated with symbols that spoke of high rank and spiritual authority. But it was his eyes that held Margaret captive. Dark, intelligent, and impossibly penetrating, they seemed to see straight through her pretenses to the truth beneath. Ayana stepped forward and spoke to his father in Shoshone, his tone formal and respectful. Margaret caught her own name in the flow of syllables, along with what she assumed was a recounting of recent events. Throughout the recitation, Chief Washeki's gaze never left Margaret's face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel transparent. When Ayana finished speaking, the chief rose gracefully from his seat and approached their group. He was taller than Margaret had expected, and despite his age, he moved with the fluid strength of a much younger man. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he said, his English clear and precise with only the slightest accent. "I am Washaki, chief of the Eastern Shoshone. My son tells me you saved his life." "I did what anyone would do," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Chief Washaki's mouth curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "My son predicted you would say that. He also told me you are wrong, that many people would not have risked themselves for a stranger, especially one from a different people." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I couldn't just leave him there." "No," the chief agreed. "You could not. And that tells me much about your character." He began to circle her slowly, not menacingly, but with the careful attention of someone conducting a thorough evaluation. Margaret forced herself to stand still and meet his gaze when it fell upon her, though every instinct urged her to look away from those penetrating eyes. "Tell me about yourself, Margaret O'Sullivan," the chief commanded. "Not what you think I want to hear, but the truth about who you are and what has shaped you." For the next hour, Margaret found herself sharing her life story in more detail than she had ever revealed to anyone except Thomas. Chief Washaki listened with complete attention, occasionally asking probing questions that forced her to examine her own motivations and choices more deeply than she ever had before. She spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her parents' deaths, her marriage to Thomas, and their dreams of building a life in the West. She talked about the loneliness following Thomas's death, the struggles of maintaining the homestead alone, and the gradual erosion of her hope for the future. And she described, with growing emotion, how finding Ayanna had awakened something in her that she had thought was permanently lost. "And what do you hope to gain from coming here?" the chief asked when she had finished her recitation. "Honestly, I don't know," Margaret replied. "A week ago, I thought I knew what my life was and where it was headed. Now everything has changed, and I'm not sure what I want or what's even possible." "At least you speak truthfully about your uncertainty," Chief Washaki observed. "Many people in your position would make grand promises they could not keep or claim understanding they do not possess." The chief returned to his seat and studied Margaret for several more long minutes. The silence in the lodge was complete, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of wind through the smoke hole above. "Nayeli," the chief said finally, still looking at Margaret, "tell us what you have seen." Nayeli stepped forward, her expression serious. "I have dreamed of her coming, Father. For many moons now, the spirits have shown me visions of a woman with golden hair who would arrive in a time of great change. In my dreams, she stands at the center of a great circle, with our people on one side and her people on the other, and her hands reach out to touch both." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "You dreamed about me? Before we met?" "The spirits show us what may come to pass, not always what will come to pass," Nayeli replied carefully. "But yes, I have seen you in my visions for many months." Chief Washaki nodded thoughtfully. "And what did these visions tell you about her purpose?" "That she would be a bridge," Nayeli said simply. "A connection between worlds that have grown too far apart. But also that she would face a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of many others." "What kind of choice?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "That has not been revealed to me," Nayeli admitted. "I know only that the moment of choosing draws near." Chief Washaki rose again and walked to a wooden chest that sat against one wall of the lodge. From it, he withdrew an object wrapped in soft deerskin. Returning to Margaret, he carefully unwrapped what appeared to be an ancient piece of jewelry, a necklace made of silver and turquoise with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story in symbols. "This belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," the chief said reverently. "It has been passed down through our family for generations, worn only by women who have been chosen for special purposes." Margaret stared at the beautiful necklace, afraid to ask what he intended. "According to our traditions," Chief Washaki continued, "this necklace can only be worn by a woman who has proven her courage, her compassion, and her commitment to peace between peoples. My grandmother wore it when she helped negotiate the first treaty with white explorers. My mother wore it when she convinced warring tribes to join together against common enemies." He held the necklace out toward Margaret, and she could see her own reflection in the polished silver and stone. "I would be honored if you would accept this as a symbol of your place in our family and your role as a bridge between our peoples." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the necklace. It was heavier than she had expected, and warm to the touch as if it held some inner fire. "I don't know if I'm worthy of such an honor," she whispered. "Worthiness is not something you claim," the chief replied. "It is something you grow into. The necklace will remind you daily of the responsibilities you have accepted." As Chief Washaki fastened the necklace around Margaret's throat, she felt a strange tingling sensation, as if some kind of energy was flowing from the ancient jewelry into her body. The sensation was not unpleasant, but it was definitely supernatural in a way that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. "There is one more matter we must discuss," the chief said, returning to his seat. "The question of your future." Margaret touched the necklace nervously. "What do you mean?" "You cannot return to your old life unchanged," Chief Washaki said bluntly. "Too much has happened, too many connections have been formed. You must choose a new path forward. What are my options?" The chief glanced at Ayanna, who had remained silent throughout the ceremony, but whose eyes had never left Margaret's face. "You may return to your homestead under our protection," the chief began. "We will station warriors nearby to ensure your safety, and you will be considered a permanent ally of our people. Trade relationships, mutual defense, regular visits you would maintain your independence while gaining the security of our friendship." Margaret nodded, understanding that this was probably the safest and most practical choice. "Or," the chief continued, "you may choose to remain here permanently, to become truly one of our people through adoption into our clan. You would learn our ways, participate in our ceremonies, and help us navigate the changing relationships with white settlers who continue to move into our traditional territories." This option was more challenging but also more appealing than Margaret had expected. The warmth and acceptance she had found with Ayanna's family was something she had missed desperately since Thomas's death. "Is there a third option?" she asked, sensing there was something more the chief hadn't yet revealed. Chief Washaki and Ayanna exchanged a long look before the chief spoke again. "There's a third path," he said slowly, "but it requires an explanation of certain traditions that may seem strange to you." Margaret waited, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Among our people, when someone saves the life of a chief's heir, it creates a special bond that goes beyond simple gratitude. In ancient times, such bonds were often formalized through marriage, creating permanent alliances between families or tribes." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she suddenly understood where this conversation was heading. "My son has expressed his desire to honor this tradition," Chief Washaki continued, "if you would be willing to consider such an arrangement." Margaret turned to look at Ayanna, who was watching her with an expression of hope and vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Are you saying—" she began, then stopped, unable to finish the question. "I am saying that Ayanna has asked for my permission to court you properly, with marriage as the ultimate goal," the chief said clearly. "If you are willing to consider such a possibility." The lodge seemed to spin around Margaret as she tried to process this unexpected development. Marriage? To Ayanna? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying in ways she couldn't begin to sort through. "This is very sudden," she managed to say. "Important decisions often are," Chief Washaki replied. "But you do not need to choose today. Take time to think, to understand what each path would mean for your life." "How much time do I have?" "The seasonal ceremonies begin in 7 days," the chief said. "If you choose the third path, it would be appropriate to announce your engagement during those celebrations. If you choose differently, that is also acceptable." 7 days to decide whether to marry a man she had known for barely a week, to join permanently with a people whose ways were still largely foreign to her, to leave behind everything familiar and venture into a completely unknown future. It should have been impossible to consider seriously. But as Margaret looked around the lodge at the faces watching her, Nayli's encouraging smile, Takota's hopeful grin, Kohana's wise nod, and most of all Ayanna's quiet intensity, she realized the choice might not be as difficult as it seemed. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, truly valued, truly loved. The question was whether she had the courage to embrace such an unexpected gift. "I will need to think carefully about this," Margaret said finally. "Of course," Chief Washaki agreed. "Nayeli will help you understand what each choice would mean. Practically, take all the time you need to make a decision your heart can live with." As the formal meeting concluded and the family began to leave the council lodge, Ayanna approached Margaret quietly. "I know this is overwhelming," he said gently. "I do not want you to feel pressured into anything you are not ready for." "But you hope I'll say yes," Margaret observed. "I hope you'll follow your heart," Ayanna replied. "Whatever that tells you to do." As they walked through the village toward the lodge where Margaret would be staying, she found herself touching the ancient necklace at her throat. 7 days to choose between 3 very different futures. 7 days to decide whether she was brave enough to trust and love again. 7 days to determine whether Margaret O'Sullivan would remain a widow living alone on the frontier, or become something entirely new and wonderful that she had never dared to dream possible. The 7 days that followed passed like a dream wrapped in starlight. Margaret found herself living in a beautifully appointed lodge beside Nayeli's, treated with a respect and warmth that made her feel treasured rather than merely tolerated. Each day brought new experiences that opened her eyes to the richness of Shoshone culture and the depth of their spiritual traditions. Nayeli became her guide and teacher, patiently explaining customs and ceremonies while helping Margaret understand the full implications of each path before her. The women of the village welcomed her with gifts: beautifully crafted moccasins, a warm winter coat made from the softest deerskin, and intricate beadwork that told stories of courage and love. "They make these gifts because they hope you will stay," Nazali explained as Margaret admired a particularly beautiful hair ornament. "But also because gift-giving is how we show respect for someone's importance to our community." "I feel like I'm receiving far more than I've given," Margaret confessed. "That is because you do not yet understand the value of what you have already given us," Nayeli replied with a mysterious smile. "Hope is the most precious gift of all." Ayanna appeared each morning to invite Margaret on walks through the village and surrounding mountains. These excursions allowed them to talk privately about their growing feelings while maintaining the propriety that Shoshone customs demanded. Margaret found herself looking forward to these moments with an eagerness that surprised her with its intensity. During one such walk, as they stood overlooking the valley where the village nestled like a jewel among the mountains, Ayanna shared more of his vision for the future. "I have dreams of our peoples learning from each other," he said, his voice carrying quiet passion. "Your people have skills in farming and building that could help us adapt to the changing world. Our people have knowledge of the land and its spirits that could help yours live more harmoniously with nature. And you think our marriage could help make that possible?" Margaret asked. "I think love has the power to overcome barriers that politics and treaties cannot touch," Ayanna replied. "Simply, when people see 2 hearts join despite their different backgrounds, it becomes harder to hate and easier to hope." Margaret felt her resolve wavering as she looked at his earnest face. The man standing beside her was not just offering her personal happiness, but the chance to be part of something larger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. On the 5th day, a commotion at the village entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of riders was approaching under a white flag, white settlers by their appearance, but moving with obvious peaceful intentions. Margaret felt her stomach clench as she recognized one of the figures, Samuel Morrison, a trader from Bear Creek who had known both her and Thomas. Chief Washaki met the delegation with formal dignity, and Margaret watched from a respectful distance. As negotiations took place, she could see Morrison scanning the crowd, his eyes widening when he spotted her among the Shoshone women. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, conducted in a mixture of English and sign language that allowed both sides to communicate effectively. When it concluded, Morrison was escorted to where Margaret stood, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "When the Army patrol found your cabin empty, folks feared the worst. There's been search parties out looking for you for days." "I'm perfectly safe, Mr. Morrison," Margaret replied calmly. "I came here voluntarily." Morrison's eyes took in her transformed appearance, the traditional clothing, the ancient necklace, the confident way she stood among the Shoshone women. "Ma'am, I don't pretend to understand what's happened here, but if you're being held against your will... I'm not," Margaret assured him firmly. "I'm here because I choose to be." "The territorial governor's getting pressure from Washington about Indian troubles," Morrison continued. "There's talk of sending more troops, maybe even relocating some of the tribes. If you were to come back with me now, tell them how well you've been treated here, it might help calm things down." Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Her testimony could indeed influence how the territorial authorities dealt with the Shoshone people. But what would returning to her old life cost her personally? "May I have until tomorrow to consider your request?" she asked. Morrison nodded. "Chief Washaki's offered us hospitality for the night. We'll leave whenever you're ready." That evening, Margaret found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. Chief Washaki had made it clear that if she chose to return with Morrison, she would carry with her the tribe's message of peace and their hope for better relations with white settlers. It would be a form of service, but one that would likely mean giving up any chance of personal happiness with Ayanna. She sat by the fire in her lodge, staring into the dancing flames as if they might reveal the right path forward. When soft footsteps announced a visitor, she looked up to find Ayanna standing in the entrance. "May I come in?" he asked formally. Margaret nodded, and he settled beside her near the fire. For a long time they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames and listening to the night sounds of the village around them. "Morrison's arrival changes things," Ayanna said finally. "Does it?" Margaret asked. "Or does it just clarify what my choices really mean? If you return with him, you could help prevent conflict between our peoples," Ayanna said quietly. "Your voice might carry more weight than any treaty or delegation. And if I stay, then you would be choosing personal happiness over public service," Ayanna replied honestly. "Some would say that is selfish." Margaret turned to look at him, seeing the pain he was trying to hide behind his noble words. "Is that what you think?" "I think," Ayanna said carefully, "that love without honor is worthless, but honor without love is empty. The question is whether you can find a way to serve both." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at his selflessness. Even now, facing the possibility of losing her, he was encouraging her to choose duty over desire. "What if there was a fourth option?" she asked suddenly. "What if we could find a way to serve the cause of peace together?" Ayanna looked at her with interest. "What do you mean?" "Morrison said the territorial authorities are concerned about Indian troubles. What if, instead of me going back alone to tell them the Shoshone are peaceful, we both went? What if our marriage became a symbol of alliance rather than just personal happiness?" Ayanna's eyes widened as he considered the implications. "It would be dangerous. Many of your people would not accept such a union. Many of mine would see it as abandonment of our traditions. But it would be unprecedented," Margaret continued, warming to the idea. "A formal alliance sealed by marriage, with both of us serving as ambassadors to our respective peoples. We could travel between communities, helping to negotiate treaties and resolve conflicts. It would mean never truly belonging to either world," Ayanna warned. "But it would mean helping to build a bridge between them," Margaret replied. "Isn't that what Nayeli's visions showed? Me standing between two peoples, reaching out to both?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he thought through her proposal. "My father would need to approve such an arrangement, and Morrison would have to be convinced to take our proposal back to the territorial authorities." "Then let's ask them," Margaret said, feeling a surge of certainty that surprised her with its strength. The next morning, Margaret and Ayanna presented their unconventional proposal to both Chief Washaki and Samuel Morrison. The trader was initially skeptical, but as they outlined their vision of a formal peace alliance sealed by marriage, his expression grew thoughtful. "It's unprecedented," Morrison admitted, "but these are unprecedented times. The governors are under pressure to find solutions that don't involve military force. This could be exactly what he's looking for. Chief Washaki listened to the entire proposal before speaking. "You would be taking great risks," he said to his son. "Living between two worlds is never easy." "But someone must build the first bridge," Ayanna replied. "Why not us?" The chief turned to Margaret. "And you, Margaret O'Sullivan? Are you prepared for the challenges such a life would bring? You would face hostility from some of your own people, suspicion from some of mine." "I'm prepared to try," Margaret said firmly. "I've learned this week that the greatest regrets come from chances not taken, not from chances that don't work out as planned." Chief Washaki smiled for the first time since the negotiations began. "Then you have my blessing, and my promise that this alliance will be honored by all our people." Morrison nodded slowly. "I'll take your proposal to the territorial capital. Can't promise what the response will be, but I think you've got a real chance of making this work." That afternoon, as Morrison's delegation prepared to leave with their unprecedented proposal, the village erupted in celebration. The seasonal ceremonies Chief Washaki had mentioned were beginning, and Margaret found herself at the center of festivities unlike anything she had ever experienced. Drums echoed through the valley as dancers in elaborate costumes told stories of creation, heroism, and love. Margaret watched in wonder as Ayanna joined one of the dances, his movements graceful and powerful despite his recently healed arm. When the dance concluded and he approached her, breathing hard but smiling broadly, she felt her heart swell with pride and love. "There is one more ceremony," Nayeli announced, appearing beside them with an expression of barely contained excitement. "The presentation of the wedding horses." "Wedding horses?" Margaret asked. "A tradition when a marriage alliance is announced," Ayanna explained. "The groom's family presents horses to demonstrate their wealth and the high value they place on the union." Margaret was led to a place of honor beside Chief Washaki as the entire village gathered in a great circle. At a signal from the chief, a group of young warriors drove a herd of magnificent horses into the center of the circle. Margaret gasped at the sight. There had to be at least 50 animals, each one clearly chosen for its beauty, strength, and breeding quality. "These horses represent our family's commitment to you and to the alliance you will represent," Chief Washaki announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the gathering. "They are a gift freely given, with no expectation of return except your happiness and the peace you will help build between our peoples." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she watched the beautiful animals circle the gathering. The generosity was overwhelming, but more than that, she could see the hope and love in the faces around her. These people had embraced her completely, trusting her with their dreams for the future. Ayanna took her hand as the ceremony concluded with more singing and dancing that continued long into the night. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked quietly as they stood together under the star-filled sky. Margaret thought about her old life, the quiet homestead, the predictable routines, the safety of solitude. Then she looked around at the celebration. Surrounding them, felt the weight of the ancient necklace at her throat, and considered the uncertain but promising future that lay ahead. "None at all," she said firmly. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Even though we don't know what response Morrison will bring back from the territorial capital?" "Even then," Margaret replied. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As if summoned by her words, Nayeli approached them, her face glowing with joy and something that looked like prophecy fulfilled. "I had another vision last night," she said quietly. "I saw children playing in a village where Shoshone tipis stood, beside log cabins where people of different colors worked side by side in peace. The spirits are pleased with the choice you have made." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the nearby fires. "Children? Many children," Nayeli said with a knowing smile. "The bridge you build between peoples will be walked by generations not yet born." 3 weeks later, Morrison returned with news that exceeded everyone's hopes. The territorial governor had not only approved their proposal, but had convinced Washington to establish a formal protectorate status for Chief Washaki's territory, with Ayanna and Margaret serving as official liaisons between the Shoshone Nation and the United States government. On a crisp October morning, with the aspen leaves turning gold in the surrounding mountains, Margaret O'Sullivan and Ayanna, son of Chief Washaki, were married in a ceremony that blended traditions from both their cultures. Margaret wore a white dress she had sewn herself, combined with traditional Shoshone jewelry and the ancient necklace that marked her as a bridge between worlds. As they exchanged vows in both English and Shoshone, Margaret thought about the storm that had brought them together and the much larger storm of change that was reshaping the American frontier. She had begun this journey as a lonely widow with little hope for the future. She was ending it as a wife, an ambassador, and a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, understanding over prejudice. The wedding horses pranced in their corral nearby, their presence a reminder of the trust that had been placed in her and the responsibilities she had accepted. But as she looked into Ayanna's eyes and spoke the words that would bind their lives together, Margaret felt only joy and anticipation for the adventures that lay ahead. Behind them, the Shoshone village celebrated with songs that would be remembered for generations. Ahead of them lay a future full of challenges and possibilities, heartbreak and triumph, but most of all, hope. Margaret O'Sullivan had saved a life during a storm and discovered that sometimes the greatest rescues are the ones we don't see coming, the moments when helping someone else saves us in return. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.